July 28th, 1402. The dust cloud rising over the Chubut plain near Ankara was visible for miles. Two massive armies were converging, each commanded by one of the most feared warlords of their age. Sultan Bayezid I of the Ottoman Empire, fresh from crushing a European crusader army at Nicopolis, led 85,000 troops toward what he believed would be another decisive victory. Facing him was Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, the conqueror who claimed descent from Genghis Khan himself, at the head of 140,000 warriors and 32 war elephants. The men under Bayezid's banner believed their heavy cavalry, supported by elite Janissary infantry and Serbian knights in full-plate armour, represented the peak of medieval warfare. They were about to discover how wrong they were. This is the story of how Central Asian horse archers, wielding composite bows perfected over centuries, systematically destroyed one of the most powerful military forces in the medieval world, and how Tamerlane's understanding of mobility, firepower, and psychological warfare rewrote the rules of battle. To understand what happened at Ankara, we need to understand the weapon that made Tamerlane's army so devastating. The composite bow carried by Timurid horse archers wasn't just another bow, it was a technological marvel, a laminated weapon constructed from horn, wood, sinew, and glue that represented centuries of refinement by the nomadic peoples of Central Asia. The construction process took months. Artisans would start with a wooden core, typically maple or bamboo, providing the bow's basic structure. On the belly of the bow, the side facing the archer, they would attach plates of horn, usually from water buffalo or mountain sheep. Horn has a unique property. Under compression, it stores tremendous energy without breaking. On the outer face, away from the archer, they layered sinew, taken from the backs and legs of deer, moose, or wild sheep. Sinew possesses an extraordinary quality. Unlike most materials, its strength actually increases when stretched. The molecular structure of collagen, the protein in tendons, creates a form of elasticity that acts like a biological spring. When you draw the bow, the horn compresses, the sinew stretches, and when you release, both snap back with explosive force, propelling the arrow forward with devastating velocity. These composite bows were surprisingly compact, typically between 44 and 52 inches in length when strung. This shorter length was crucial for mounted archery. A longer bow would be impossible to maneuver on horseback. But don't let the size fool you. Testing of reconstructed Timurid-era bows has demonstrated draw weights ranging from 80 to over 150 pounds for the heaviest war bows. To put that in perspective, the famous English longbow, which required years of training to use effectively, typically had a draw weight of 80 to 100 pounds. The Timurid composite bow matched or exceeded this in a package less than half the size. The arrows themselves were equally sophisticated. Birch shafts, about 30 to 40 inches long and roughly half an inch in diameter, were fletched with tail feathers from cranes, eagles, or other large birds. Tail feathers were preferred because they flowed more smoothly through the air than wing feathers. The arrowheads varied by purpose. For armour penetration, Timurid archers used bodkin points, narrow steel heads with a square or diamond cross-section designed to concentrate force on a tiny surface area. These weren't crude spikes. They were carefully forged and sometimes hardened, tapered behind the initial punch shape to reduce drag. A well-made bodkin point could be up to 4.5 inches long. Modern testing has revealed the devastating performance of these weapons. Turkish composite bows, virtually identical in design to those used by Tamerlane's forces, have achieved arrow velocities between 185 and 205 feet per second with standard tactical arrows. With lighter flight arrows and specialized technique, skilled archers could exceed 200 meters of accurate range, with maximum range extending to 250 meters or more. But effective range in combat wasn't about maximum distance. It was about the range at which arrows could defeat armor and kill or disable the target. For Timurid horse archers, this meant roughly 100 to 150 yards for precision shooting against individual targets and up to 200 yards for massed volleys against formations. The key advantage wasn't just power or range, it was the rate of fire. A skilled horse archer could loose an arrow every 3 to 4 seconds while moving at full gallop. This meant that a formation of 1,000 horse archers could put 15,000 to 20,000 arrows into the air every minute. That's not a rain of arrows. That's a hurricane. But the weapon was only part of the equation. The real secret was the warrior who wielded it. From childhood, boys in the Timurid domains learned to ride and shoot. By age 10, they were expected to hit targets from horseback at a gallop. By their teens, they could perform the Parthian shot, turning backward in the saddle to shoot at pursuers while retreating at full speed. This wasn't a trick. It was a fundamental combat technique that defined steppe warfare for millennia. The thumb draw, used by Timurid archers, employed only the strongest single digit, the thumb, to grasp the bowstring, with the index and middle fingers reinforcing the grip from behind. A thumb ring made of leather, bone, horn, or for wealthy warriors, silver, protected the digit from the brutal force of repeated releases. This release method had several advantages over the three-finger Mediterranean draw used by European archers. It provided a narrower grip on the string, which helped avoid string pinch with shorter bows. It also allowed for a cleaner release, with all the power coming from a single point rather than three fingers that might not release simultaneously. Training was relentless and began young. Historical accounts indicate that each Timurid warrior was expected to maintain at least 60 arrows with him at all times. They practiced on moving targets, shooting at different angles, compensating for wind and the motion of their horses. They learned to reload at full gallop, a feat that seems impossible until you watch a skilled mounted archer perform it. The process becomes automatic. Muscle memory developed through thousands of repetitions. Draw, aim, release, reach for another arrow, knock it to the string, draw again, all while controlling your mount with your legs and maintaining awareness of your position in the formation and the enemy's movements. This level of skill couldn't be improvised. It took a lifetime to develop, which is why steppe peoples who grew up in the saddle with a bow in hand possess such an overwhelming advantage over settled civilizations that tried to adopt their tactics. Now, let's talk about armour and why European knights believed they were invulnerable. By the early 15th century, European metalworking had reached extraordinary levels of sophistication. A full harness of plate armour, the kind worn by the Serbian knights fighting for Bayezid at Ankara, represented the pinnacle of protective technology. The breastplate alone could be several millimetres thick, made of hardened steel that had been carefully tempered to resist both penetration and deformation. Underneath the plate, knights wore chainmail, thousands of interlocking rings that provided flexible protection. Beneath the mail came the gambeson, a padded jacket of layered linen or wool, sometimes 30 or more layers thick, that absorbed impact and prevented the armour from bruising the wearer. A fully armoured knight was covered head to toe in steel. The helmet included a visor that could be lowered to protect the face. Articulated joints protected the elbows, knees and shoulders while still allowing movement. Even the hands were covered in articulated gauntlets. The total weight could exceed 60 pounds, but the load was distributed across the entire body. A fit man could move, fight, and even perform acrobatics in well-fitted armour. This protection came at a cost beyond weight. Visibility was limited, especially with the visor down. Hearing was muffled. The armour was expensive, requiring hundreds of hours of skilled labour to produce. But for those who could afford it, plate armour made you nearly invulnerable to most weapons of the age. Swords couldn't cut through it, axes couldn't penetrate it, even maces and warhammers designed to crush rather than cut struggled against the curved surfaces that deflected blows. And arrows. The conventional wisdom held that arrows were useless against plate armour. Modern testing has largely confirmed this. Experiments conducted by historians and armour enthusiasts have shown that even powerful longbows struggle to penetrate quality plate armour. In a famous test conducted by Todd's workshop in collaboration with armour experts, a 160-pound longbow firing hardened steel bodkin points at a reproduction 15th century breastplate failed to achieve penetration from 25 metres. The arrows dented the metal but didn't punch through. This seemingly validates what medieval knights believed. If you had money for good armour, you were safe from arrows. But here's what those tests missed. Medieval battles weren't controlled experiments against stationary targets with perfect 90-degree impacts. They were chaos. Thousands of arrows filled the air simultaneously. Not every knight wore the absolute best quality armour. Not every piece of armour covered every vulnerable point. And most importantly, armoured knights didn't fight alone. They rode horses, and horses, even armoured horses, were far more vulnerable than their riders. A destrier, the heavy warhorse used by European knights, represented an enormous investment. These animals were bred specifically for war, trained to charge into combat, and conditioned to tolerate the noise and chaos of battle. They were also enormous targets. Even with armour protection on the chest and head, which only the wealthiest knights could afford, a warhorse presented roughly 12 square feet of surface area to incoming arrows. The legs were unarmoured. The flanks, the hindquarters, the neck, all were vulnerable points. An arrow that merely wounded a horse could transform it from a controlled weapon into a panicked, uncontrollable force that endangered its rider and everyone nearby. This is what Tamerlane understood that European commanders didn't. You didn't need to kill the knight, you needed to kill his mobility. And this brings us to the fundamental tactical genius of steppe warfare. Horse archers didn't fight like European cavalry. They didn't charge in with lances levelled, seeking shock impact. They circled, harassed, retreated, and returned, firing constantly, wearing down the enemy through exhaustion, casualties, and psychological pressure. The standard Timurid tactical approach relied on several principles that had been refined over centuries. First, mobility was paramount. Never get pinned down. Never let the enemy dictate the terms of engagement. If heavy cavalry charged, the horse archers would scatter and reform elsewhere. Second, use the terrain. Force the enemy to fight on ground that favoured mobility over heavy armour. Third, target the horses, not the riders. Fourth, coordinate your attacks. Waves of arrows from multiple directions, forcing the enemy to choose which threat to face while leaving others unguarded. Fifth, psychological warfare. The constant harassment, the sound of thousands of arrows in flight, the screams of wounded horses, all of this eroded morale and discipline. Tamerlane's army at Ankara embodied these principles, but with a sophistication that went beyond simple nomadic tactics. His forces weren't purely horse archers. He had combined the traditional steppe-mounted archers with heavy cavalry, armoured lancers who could deliver decisive shock attacks. He had infantry armed with bows, axes and swords. He had war elephants captured during his invasion of India, massive beasts that could smash through formations and terrify horses unfamiliar with them. And he had something even more important. He had unified command and iron discipline. Unlike many steppe confederations that were loose alliances of tribes, Tamerlane's army was organised along strict Mongol lines. Units were grouped decimally. 10 men formed an onlik, 10 onliks formed a yuzlik of 100 men, 10 yuzliks formed a binlik of 1,000, and 10 binliks formed a tumen of 10,000. Each unit had a designated commander, and promotion was based on merit rather than birth. This organisational structure allowed for complex manoeuvres that would be impossible with less disciplined forces. So when Bayezid's army approached Ankara in late July 1402, they were already in trouble, even if they didn't know it yet. Tamerlane had outmanoeuvred them strategically. The Ottoman force had marched east from Constantinople, covering roughly 500 miles in the heat of summer. They were exhausted, their supply lines were stretched, and critically they were running low on water. Tamerlane had anticipated their approach and occupied the ground near Ankara first. His engineers had diverted the Chubut Creek, the main water source in the area, into an off-stream reservoir that he controlled. The Ottoman army arrived to find their enemy positioned on favourable ground with access to water, while they had neither. Bayezid's advisors urged him to withdraw, to take up defensive positions in the mountains and force Tamerlane to attack in difficult terrain. But Bayezid, confident in his army's strength and perhaps underestimating his opponent, chose to attack. It was exactly what Tamerlane wanted. The Ottoman deployment followed conventional medieval practice. Bayezid commanded the centre with his elite Janissary infantry, professional soldiers trained from childhood, equipped with composite bows of their own, axes and swords. His son Suleiman held the left flank with the best Ottoman troops. Stefan Lazarevich, the Serbian prince and vassal of Bayezid, commanded the right flank with his contingent of Serbian knights and Balkan troops. Another son, Mehmed, held the rear guard. The heavy cavalry, Sipiers, were positioned on the flanks. It was a strong formation, designed to absorb an attack in the centre, while the cavalry on the wings could envelope an enemy. But Tamerlane wasn't planning a conventional battle. His army deployed with cavalry corps on both flanks and his centre slightly refused, creating a concave formation. The war elephants formed the vanguard, massive and terrifying to horses that had never seen such creatures. His sons commanded the wings, and Tamerlane himself directed operations from the centre, with his personal guard of heavy cavalry. The battle began not with a charge, but with movement. Timurid horse archers flowed forward in loose formations, not dense ranks that would make easy targets. They moved in what later observers would describe as swirling patterns, units wheeling and turning in coordinated movements that must have seemed chaotic to the Ottoman soldiers, but were actually precisely controlled. And then the arrows began to fall. Not a few arrows, not dozens, thousands. The first volleys came at long range, high-angle shots that arced through the air and fell among the Ottoman formations. At this distance, the arrows lacked the velocity to penetrate the best armour, but they didn't need to. They struck horses. They found gaps in armour at joints and under helmets. They wounded unarmoured troops in the rear ranks. They created a constant din of impacts against steel and screams of wounded men and animals. This was psychological warfare as much as physical. The Ottomans couldn't effectively respond. Their own archers, the janissaries, were primarily trained as infantry. Mounted on horses, they couldn't match the mobility or skill of lifelong horse archers. Ottoman Sepahi cavalry tried to charge the horse archers, but the Timurid riders simply scattered, galloping out of reach, then reforming and resuming their fire from a different angle. This is where the genius of steppe tactics became apparent. The Ottoman heavy cavalry was fast in a straight-line charge, but they couldn't turn quickly in formation. Maintaining cohesion required discipline and coordination. When they charged toward one group of horse archers, other groups would strike them from the flanks or rear. The horsemen would be forced to wheel around to face the new threat, wasting energy and breaking their formation, and all the while, arrows continued to fall. After the initial volleys had disrupted the Ottoman formation and exhausted their horses, Tamerlane began the second phase. His right wing, commanded by his son Shah Rukh, crashed into the Ottoman left. This wasn't a horse archer attack. This was heavy cavalry, armoured warriors with lances and swords, smashing into a formation that had already been weakened by archery. The Serbian knights on the opposite flank faced a similar assault. Here, the discipline and quality of Stefan Lazarevich's troops showed. Historical accounts record that the Serbian knights, wearing heavy black plate armour, successfully repelled the initial Timurid assaults. Their armour proved highly effective against the arrows. One contemporary source noted that Timur himself admired their courage, stating they fought like lions. The Serbian knights actually cut through the Timurid ranks multiple times during the battle. Each time, Stefan reportedly urged Bayezid to break out with him, to escape while they still could. Bayezid refused, either out of pride or a belief he could still win. It's one of history's tragic decisions. The Serbian contingent eventually managed to save one of Bayezid's sons and the treasury, fighting their way clear and eventually reaching Constantinople. But the battle was being decided elsewhere. On the Ottoman left flank, Bayezid's Tatar auxiliaries, mercenaries who had been fighting for the Ottomans, made a choice. These were steppe warriors themselves, men who understood exactly what they were facing. When they saw Tamerlane's overwhelming force and recognized they were on the losing side, they switched allegiance, crossing over to join the Timurid army. This wasn't unusual in steppe warfare, where loyalty often followed strength. But for Bayezid, it was catastrophic. Suddenly, his left flank wasn't just collapsing, it was turning on him, attacking his own troops from within. Similarly, the Anatolian troops, men from Turkish emirates that Bayezid had recently conquered, began deserting or actively joining Tamerlane. These weren't cowards. They were practical men who recognized that Tamerlane was offering to restore their princes and independence if they abandoned Bayezid. As the flanks collapsed, the centre of the Ottoman army found itself surrounded. The janissaries, professional and disciplined, held their ground, fighting with the desperation of men who knew they were doomed. But they were foot soldiers, relatively slow-moving, facing mounted warriors who could strike and retreat at will. The constant arrow fire continued, wearing them down. Men fell not from single arrows, but from cumulative damage. An arrow in the leg that wasn't fatal but made movement difficult. Another in the shoulder that limited the ability to fight. The psychological toll of standing under continuous fire with no way to strike back. By late afternoon, the Ottoman army had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent force. Most had fled, died, or surrendered. Bayezid, with about 300 men, attempted to escape into the nearby mountains as darkness fell. Tamerlane's cavalry pursued them. In the dark, Bayezid's horse was killed by an arrow or fell. Accounts differ. He was captured, the first and only Ottoman sultan ever taken prisoner by an enemy. The casualty figures are disputed, but conservative estimates suggest the Ottomans lost at least 30,000 dead, with thousands more captured. Timurid losses were significantly lower, around 15,000, which tells you everything about the effectiveness of their tactics. They had defeated a force nearly their equal in numbers without suffering proportionate casualties. That's the hallmark of superior tactics and technology. What made this victory possible? It wasn't just the composite bow, though that was crucial. It wasn't just skilled horse archers, though they were essential. It was the systematic application of principles that exploited the fundamental weaknesses of heavy cavalry warfare. European knights were trained to fight in one way: charge, impact, hand-to-hand combat. Their armour made them nearly invulnerable in that context. But horse archers refused to fight that way. They turned the knight's greatest strength, his armour and willingness to charge, into a liability. The armour made him slow. The charge made him predictable. The horse made him vulnerable. And the training that taught him to seek close combat left him helpless against an enemy who would never close unless they chose to. This wasn't a one-time occurrence. Tamerlane used similar tactics throughout his campaigns. Against the Golden Horde in 1391, against the Mamluks in Syria, against the Delhi Sultanate in India. The specific details varied based on terrain and enemy, but the core approach remained constant. Use mobility to dictate the terms of engagement. Use firepower to disrupt and weaken the enemy. Use combined arms, integrating horse archers with heavy cavalry and infantry, to deliver the decisive blow when the enemy was exhausted and disorganized. The psychological dimension of this warfare can't be overstated. Imagine being an Ottoman soldier at Ankara. You're exhausted from days of marching in summer heat. You're desperately thirsty. You're watching thousands of enemy horsemen swirling around your formation, and arrows are falling constantly. You can't see where the next attack is coming from. Your friends are falling around you, horses are screaming, and every attempt to strike back meets empty air as the enemy riders scatter before your charge. You're wearing 60 pounds of armour in the heat, and your horse is equally burdened. Meanwhile, the enemy is fresh, has water, and seems to have unlimited arrows. That's not a recipe for sustained resistance. That's a recipe for collapse. And that's exactly what happened. The defections by Tatar and Anatolian troops weren't surprising. They were the logical result of being in a clearly losing position with an enemy offering better terms. The implications of Ankara echoed for decades. The Ottoman Empire, which had seemed poised to conquer Constantinople and expand into Europe, was thrown into civil war. Bayezid died in captivity 3 months later. His sons fought each other for the throne for 11 years. Constantinople, which had been under siege, received a reprieve that extended the Byzantine Empire's life by another 50 years. Tamerlane, meanwhile, turned his attention to China, dying en route in 1405. His empire fragmented after his death, but the lesson of Ankara remained. Heavy cavalry wasn't invincible, armour wasn't absolute protection. Mobility and firepower, properly applied, could defeat what seemed like unbeatable forces. It's worth noting that European commanders eventually learned these lessons. By the later stages of the 100 Years' War, English armies were increasingly fighting on foot, using massed longbowmen protected by stakes and terrain to negate French cavalry advantages. But even then, they didn't fully grasp what the steppe peoples knew instinctively. The true power of mounted archery wasn't just the bow, it was the combination of the bow with horsemanship and tactics that had been refined over millennia. The composite bow itself represented a technological achievement that Europeans never quite matched. English longbows were powerful and effective, but they required enormous physical strength to use and years of training to master. A composite bow could deliver similar power in a much smaller package that could be used from horseback. The construction technique, passed down through generations of steppe craftsmen, used materials and methods that European bowyers didn't understand or couldn't replicate. The horn, sinew, and glue construction wasn't just about power, it was about efficiency, storing maximum energy in minimum space. Let's talk numbers for a moment to understand the scale of firepower Tamerlane could deploy. Historical accounts suggest his army at Ankara included at least 100,000 cavalry, most of whom would have been horse archers or capable of dismounting to fight as archers. If even half of those were actively engaged in archery during the battle, that's 50,000 archers. At a modest rate of fire of 1 arrow every 5 seconds, that's 10,000 arrows per second, 600,000 arrows per minute. In reality, the rate of fire would have varied. Skilled archers could shoot faster, 3 to 4 seconds per arrow. Less skilled soldiers would shoot slower. But even conservative estimates put the number of arrows in the air at any given time during the height of the battle in the tens of thousands. This creates a probability problem for the defending army. Even if any individual arrow has only a small chance of causing significant damage to an armoured target, when you're facing hundreds of arrows personally, and your formation is facing thousands simultaneously, the odds of avoiding harm drop dramatically. Eventually, an arrow will find a gap in armour at the armpit or groin. Eventually, one will penetrate the thinner metal of a visor. Eventually, your horse will be struck in an unarmoured location. The math is brutal and inexorable. This is why massed archery was so effective historically. It wasn't about individual marksmanship, though that helped. It was about creating a beaten zone, an area where the density of projectiles made movement suicidal and remaining stationary meant slow attrition. Medieval commanders understood this intellectually, but experiencing it was different. The visceral reality of standing under sustained arrow fire, hearing the impacts, watching comrades fall, creates psychological pressure that's hard to convey to people who've never experienced it. There's another aspect of Ankara that's often overlooked: Tamerlane's use of terrain and logistics. By controlling the water supply, he ensured that time was on his side. Every hour the Ottomans remained on the field, they grew weaker. Their horses, already exhausted from the march, had no water. The soldiers were increasingly desperate. This forced Bayezid to attack rather than waiting for reinforcements, or trying to outmaneuver Tamerlane strategically. Once the battle was joined, the tactical situation favoured the Timurids, but the strategic situation had already been decided. This is the mark of great generalship, winning before the fighting starts by controlling the factors that determine victory. Tamerlane had studied his enemies. He knew Ottoman army composition, their tactics, their weaknesses. He'd fought similar forces before. He positioned his army to maximise his advantages and minimise Ottoman strengths. When the battle began, it was less a clash of equals and more an execution of a plan. The role of the war elephants at Ankara deserves mention. These creatures, which Tamerlane had acquired during his invasion of India, weren't primarily weapons. They were psychological tools. Horses that had never seen elephants were terrified of them. The smell, the size, the unfamiliar sight all triggered panic responses. By positioning the elephants in the vanguard, Tamerlane ensured that any Ottoman cavalry charge would have to contend with panicked horses before they even reached the Timurid lines. Historical accounts suggest the elephants were less effective than hoped. Some were killed or wounded, others ran amok. But they served their purpose by disrupting the Ottoman cavalry formations and adding to the chaos. Modern military terminology would call this combined arms warfare, using different types of troops in coordination so that each covers the weaknesses of the others. Horse archers provide mobility and firepower, but are vulnerable in close combat. Heavy cavalry provides shock power, but lacks ranged weapons. Infantry provides staying power, but lacks mobility. Elephants provide psychological impact, but are unwieldy. Used separately, each has limitations. Used together with proper coordination, they create a force where the enemy can't find an effective response. The aftermath of Ankara demonstrated another aspect of Tamerlane's strategic approach. He didn't try to hold the Ottoman territories. His army was designed for conquest, not occupation. He moved through western Anatolia, besieged and took Smyrna from the Knights Hospitaller, demonstrated his power, and then returned east. He understood that his empire, like the Mongol Empire before it, was held together by his personal authority and military success. Trying to administer settled territories while maintaining the loyalty of nomadic warriors was a contradiction that had destroyed previous steppe empires, so he took plunder, installed or restored rulers who would be loyal to him, and moved on to the next campaign. This approach worked during his lifetime but ensured that his empire wouldn't outlast him. When he died in 1405, his sons immediately began fighting each other, and the Timurid Empire fragmented. The Ottomans conversely recovered. They had a system of government that could survive military defeat and succession crises. By 1413, Mehmed I had reunited the Ottoman lands and stabilised the empire. Within 50 years, they had conquered Constantinople. Within a century, they dominated the eastern Mediterranean and threatened Vienna. So in the long term, who really won at Ankara? Militarily, it was a crushing Timurid victory. Strategically, it delayed Ottoman expansion for decades. But historically, the Ottomans survived and thrived while the Timurid Empire vanished. Does that diminish Tamerlane's achievement? Not at all. It demonstrates that military brilliance alone doesn't determine historical outcomes. Political institutions, cultural cohesion, economic foundations all matter. But on that day in July 1402, none of that mattered. What mattered was that one army had horse archers who could hit a target at 150 yards while riding at full gallop, and the other army didn't. What mattered was that one commander understood how to use mobility and firepower to defeat heavier forces, and the other didn't. What mattered was that one side had refined their tactics over centuries of steppe warfare, and the other side was learning the hard way that courage and armour aren't always enough. The lessons of Ankara weren't lost on contemporary observers. The Mamluks in Egypt, who had successfully defeated Mongol invasions in the 13th century, noted that their own horse archers and combined arms tactics had been validated. European military thinkers, to the extent they paid attention to events in Anatolia, recognized that cavalry warfare was evolving. The increasing use of foot soldiers, archers, and later firearms reflected a broader trend, away from the dominance of heavy cavalry that had characterized medieval warfare. But it would take another century for these lessons to fully sink in. The Battle of Agincourt in 1415 demonstrated similar principles. English longbowmen, fighting on foot in defensive positions, destroyed a French army that had more and better armoured knights. The mud at Agincourt played a role, slowing the French cavalry, but the underlying dynamic was the same as Ankara. Massed archery could defeat armoured cavalry if properly applied. The key was refusing to fight on the cavalry's terms. There's a broader historical pattern here worth noting. Throughout military history, technological or tactical innovations create temporary advantages that seem overwhelming. Heavy cavalry dominated European warfare for centuries because they were nearly impossible to stop in a charge and nearly invulnerable once engaged. But every advantage eventually meets a countermeasure. English longbowmen, Swiss pikemen, Flemish infantry with Gurdondags all found ways to defeat heavy cavalry. Horse archers had been doing it for millennia. The composite bow was the technological enabler, but the tactics were the real innovation. Understanding that you don't need to fight the enemy's strengths, you can attack their weaknesses. An armoured knight is strong in close combat but vulnerable to missiles. His horse is essential to his effectiveness, but more vulnerable than he is. His armour makes him powerful but also slow and exhausting to wear. His training emphasises individual, combat prowess but may neglect coordinated manoeuvre. All of these are exploitable. Tamerlane understood this at a level that went beyond simple tactical knowledge. He understood war as a system where logistics, psychology, terrain, technology and leadership all interact. His campaigns were brutal by any standard. The pyramids of skulls he left behind earned him a reputation as one of history's most ruthless conquerors. But within the framework of military effectiveness, he was arguably the most skilled practitioner of steppe warfare since Genghis Khan. His armies were better organised, better equipped, and more diverse than earlier Mongol forces. He had learned from their successes and failures. He integrated infantry and siege weapons that gave him options the purely nomadic Mongols lacked. He maintained the mobility and archery skills that made steppe armies so deadly, while adding the sustainability and administrative capacity needed to maintain an empire. The result was a military machine that could defeat any contemporary force when properly deployed. The tragic irony is that this type of warfare was nearing its end. Within a century, firearms would begin to dominate battlefields. The composite bow, no matter how skillfully used, couldn't compete with weapons that could be learned in weeks rather than years, and penetrated armour more reliably. Horse archers would linger on the periphery of military affairs for another few centuries. The Cossacks, the Polish winged hussars, Ottoman sipahis all used mounted archery into the 17th century. But they were increasingly anachronistic. The future belonged to gunpowder, not horn and sinew. This makes Ankara something of a sunset battle, the last major victory of horse archers over heavy cavalry using traditional methods before the gunpowder revolution changed everything. It demonstrated the absolute peak of what mounted archery could achieve when practiced by masters against opponents who hadn't adapted to counter it. In that sense, it's a fitting capstone to a military tradition that stretched back thousands of years. For the Ottoman soldiers who survived Ankara, the memory must have been traumatic. They had gone into battle confident in their strength, expecting victory. They found themselves in a nightmare where nothing worked as it should. Charges that should have scattered the enemy met empty air. Armour that should have protected them proved inadequate against the arrow storm. Their numbers, which should have been an advantage, meant nothing when the enemy could refuse combat and strike from range, and their leaders' decisions, which should have led to glory, instead led to disaster and captivity. It's the kind of defeat that changes how an army thinks about warfare. The Ottomans learned from Ankara. Their later armies incorporated more firearms, better coordination between arms, and an understanding that mobility had value beyond the shock charge. They never forgot that lesson, which is part of why they eventually conquered Constantinople and much of southeastern Europe. As for Tamerlane, Ankara was one of many victories in a career of conquest that covered much of Central Asia, Persia, and the Middle East. But it was perhaps his most strategically significant, demonstrating that even the powerful Ottoman Empire could be defeated by superior tactics and generalship. His army's performance vindicated everything his culture had learned about warfare over centuries. The composite bow, the horsemanship, the tactics of encirclement and harassment, the combined arms coordination, all came together in a nearly perfect execution. It's the kind of battle that military historians study not because it changed everything, but because it demonstrated everything working at the highest level. If you want to understand how horse archers fought, study Ankara. If you want to understand how to defeat numerically equal or superior heavy cavalry, study Ankara. If you want to understand the importance of logistics and strategic positioning before battle, study Ankara. It encapsulates the lessons of centuries of steppe warfare in a single afternoon. The death of Bayezid in captivity 3 months after the battle closed one chapter of history. He had been one of the most successful Ottoman rulers, expanding the empire dramatically, defeating crusaders, besieging Constantinople. But he had made the fundamental error of fighting an enemy on that enemy's terms. He had rushed to battle when he should have delayed. He had attacked when he should have defended. He had kept fighting when he should have retreated. These are lessons that every commander must learn, often through painful experience. The tragic part is that he had advisors who told him the right course of action. He chose not to listen, perhaps out of pride, perhaps out of overconfidence in his army's capabilities. The result was disaster, not just for him personally, but for his entire empire. It's a reminder that in war, the consequences of mistakes are measured in lives and nations. 7 centuries later, we can look back at Ankara with the perspective of hindsight and see the forces in motion that neither Bayezid nor Tamerlane could fully understand. The medieval period was ending. The age of gunpowder was beginning. The military tactics that had dominated warfare for a millennium were being superseded. But in that moment, on that field, what mattered was skill with the composite bow, understanding of mobile warfare, and the discipline to execute complex maneuvers under pressure. Tamerlane's army possessed all of these in abundance, and Bayezid's army, for all its courage and equipment, did not. The outcome was inevitable once battle was joined, though the specific details of the collapse, the defections, the desperate stands, the final pursuit, all of these were contingent on human decisions and chance. But the framework was set by centuries of development in military technology and tactics. One aspect of the composite bow's effectiveness that deserves deeper examination is its performance across different environmental conditions. Unlike firearms, which would later struggle with moisture and required dry powder, the composite bow remained functional in rain, though its performance degraded somewhat as the sinew absorbed water. Skilled archers knew to protect their bows with leather covers when not in use, and the best weapons were treated with oils and waxes that helped repel moisture. In the dry climate of Anatolia in July, this wasn't a concern, but it mattered in other campaigns. The bow's performance also varied with temperature. Cold weather made the glue and sinew less elastic, reducing power. This is why steppe armies traditionally campaigned in spring through fall and avoided winter warfare when possible. The weapon that gave them such an advantage had limitations tied to natural materials and environmental conditions. The training regimen for Timurid horse archers was comprehensive in ways that modern military training might recognize, but medieval European military culture didn't emphasize. Beyond simple archery and riding skills, warriors learned battlefield discipline, how to maintain formation while moving at speed, how to recognize and respond to signals from commanders, how to coordinate attacks with other units. The decimal organization meant that every warrior knew exactly where he belonged in the hierarchy and who his immediate commander was. This prevented the confusion that often plagued medieval armies, where individual nobles commanded their own retinues with varying degrees of coordination with the overall battle plan. When a Timurid commander signaled for a wheel to the left, 10,000 horsemen could execute the maneuver with precision, because they had practiced it countless times and knew their roles. The psychological preparation was equally important. Horse archers needed to maintain composure while being charged by heavy cavalry, trusting in their horses' speed and their own skill to evade rather than panicking and breaking formation. They needed to resist the urge to close with the enemy when arrows were having effect, maintaining the disciplined harassment that was their greatest tactical advantage. They needed to conserve arrows, not wasting shots at extreme range where effectiveness was low, but also not holding fire so long that opportunities were missed. All of this required judgment that came from experience and training. Young warriors learned by fighting alongside veterans, observing, imitating, receiving correction. It was an apprenticeship system that produced highly skilled soldiers, but required years to create a fully effective warrior. The economic system that supported Timurid armies deserves attention as well. Steppe societies were pastoral, moving with their herds, which meant every warrior was also a herdsman and potentially a craftsman. The same skills that made you good at managing livestock, reading terrain, understanding animal behavior, predicting weather, all translated directly to military effectiveness. The economy produced the horses needed for mobility, the animals that provided horn and sinew for bows, the leather for armour and equipment. Trade routes brought metal for arrowheads and armour, specialised materials and luxury goods that served as rewards and incentives. The system was efficient in ways that settled agricultural societies weren't. A farmer conscripted for war had to leave his fields, reducing food production. A nomadic herdsman brought his economic base with him. His herds travelled with the army, providing food and replacements for horses. This gave steppe armies sustainability that agricultural societies struggled to match. Tamerlane had enhanced this traditional system by controlling cities along the Silk Road, which gave him access to craftsmen, wealth, and specialised goods. His capital at Samarkand became a centre of culture and commerce, drawing artisans from across the Islamic world and beyond. The revenue from trade funded his armies and allowed him to pay soldiers in addition to granting them shares of plunder. This combination of traditional steppe warfare with the resources of settled civilization gave his armies advantages that earlier nomadic conquerors lacked. He could maintain larger forces for longer campaigns. He could afford better equipment. He could employ siege engineers and specialized troops that purely nomadic armies couldn't sustain. Yet he avoided the trap that had destroyed previous steppe empires, becoming so sedentary that the warriors lost their edge. His armies remained primarily mobile and cavalry-based, using the wealth of cities to enhance rather than replace traditional capabilities. The intelligence gathering that preceded Ankara was another factor in Timurid's success. Tamerlane's forces included scouts and spies who gathered information about Ottoman movements, strength, morale, and intentions. By the time the armies met, Tamerlane likely knew more about Bayezid's forces than Bayezid knew about his. This information advantage allowed for better planning. Knowing the Ottoman route of march meant positioning forces to control water sources. Knowing the composition of Ottoman forces, including the Tatar and Anatolian contingents whose loyalty was questionable, meant planning for potential defections. Knowing Ottoman tactical doctrine meant preparing counters for their expected moves. This wasn't luck or intuition, it was systematic intelligence work that gave concrete advantages. The archery techniques themselves varied based on situation and target. Against unarmoured or lightly armoured targets, archers could use lighter arrows that flew farther and faster, maximising range and rate of fire. Against heavy armour, they switched to heavier bodkin-pointed arrows that sacrificed some range for greater penetration. The ability to adjust tactics based on the enemy was crucial. At Ankara, facing a mix of heavily armoured knights, moderately armoured cavalry and lighter infantry, Timurid archers would have used different arrow types throughout the battle as they engaged different targets. The logistics of maintaining arrow supply during extended combat was significant. 60 arrows per man sounds like a lot, until you consider that at a rate of fire of 1 arrow every 4 seconds, that's less than 4 minutes of continuous shooting. Battles lasted hours. This meant that arrow resupply was critical, with pack animals carrying additional arrows that could be distributed during lulls in combat. The role of standards and signals in controlling the battle deserves emphasis. In the noise and confusion of combat involving over 200,000 men, verbal commands were useless beyond a few dozen feet. Timurid commanders used horns, drums, and visual signals, flags and standards that could be seen at distance. Different signals meant different tactical instructions. 3 horn blasts might mean advance, 2 might mean wheel right, 1 long blast might mean withdraw. The exact signals would have been known to every warrior through training. This allowed for complex coordinated movements that appeared almost choreographed to observers. When you see descriptions of horse archer formations flowing and swirling like water, this wasn't spontaneous. It was disciplined execution of practiced maneuvers in response to signals. The commanders positioned where they could observe the entire battlefield, or at least their portion of it, and direct their units accordingly. The mental calculation required for effective mounted archery was substantial. An archer had to estimate range to target, adjust for the motion of his own horse, account for wind if present, compensate for the arc of the arrow, and anticipate the target's movement if shooting at mobile enemies. All of this had to happen in a fraction of a second, repeated continuously throughout the battle. It's the kind of intuitive physics that athletes develop, where conscious calculation is too slow but trained instinct produces accurate results. Modern studies of expert performance show that this kind of skill requires roughly 10,000 hours of practice to develop, which maps well to the childhood to adulthood training regimen of steppe warriors. By the time a man was 20 years old and participating in major campaigns, he had likely spent well over 10,000 hours on horseback with a bow, developing the unconscious competence that allowed for effectiveness in combat. The wounds produced by arrows were particularly dangerous in the medieval period because of infection risk. Even a relatively minor wound could become infected and fatal in an era before antibiotics. Arrow wounds were especially problematic because the arrow could carry cloth or dirt deep into the body. The extraction of arrows was also dangerous, particularly bodkin points, which could be difficult to remove without causing additional damage. Medieval surgeons developed specialized tools for arrow extraction, but in the chaos of battle and its immediate aftermath, proper medical treatment was often impossible. This meant that the casualty figures from battles like Ankara don't tell the full story. Men who survived the battle itself might die days or weeks later from infected wounds. The psychological impact of this on survivors was significant. Knowing that any wound might prove fatal increased the terror of standing under sustained arrow fire. The armour that failed to protect Ottoman forces at Ankara wasn't defective. It was simply designed for a different type of warfare. Plate armour evolved to counter the weapons of European medieval combat, primarily swords, axes, and lances used in close quarters. Against these weapons, properly made plate armour was extraordinarily effective. But the volume of archery fire that horse archers could produce created a different challenge, one that armour design hadn't fully accounted for. Later armour developments, including more complete coverage and the addition of mail skirts to protect the legs while mounted, reflected lessons learned from encounters with mounted archers and later with firearms. But these improvements came too late for the men at Ankara, and added weight that further reduced mobility, creating a spiral where protection increased but effectiveness decreased. The question of why European forces didn't develop their own horse archer corps is worth examining. Some attempts were made, particularly in Eastern Europe where contact with steppe peoples was frequent. Hungarian and Polish forces incorporated light cavalry with composite bows, and these units proved effective. But Western European military culture was deeply invested in the heavy cavalry ideal. Knighthood was tied to social status, land ownership, and cultural identity in ways that went beyond simple military effectiveness. To admit that a lightly armed commoner on a fast horse with a bow was more militarily valuable than an armoured knight threatened the entire social order. Additionally, the training time and cultural background needed to produce effective horse archers meant that you couldn't simply decide to create such a force. It required generations of tradition, appropriate breeds of horses, and a pastoral lifestyle that provided constant practice in riding and shooting. European agricultural societies didn't have these foundations. The speed of collapse at Ankara, once it began, reflected the fragility of medieval armies generally. Unlike modern military forces with deep command structures and redundant systems, medieval armies often depended on the personal authority of commanders and the coherence of relatively small unit formations. When key nobles were killed or captured, their retinues might disintegrate. When one section of the line broke, panic could spread rapidly. The defection of the Tatar and Anatolian contingents created cascading failure. As troops saw others defecting or fleeing, their own morale collapsed. The discipline of the Janissaries in holding their ground despite the disaster around them was exceptional, and speaks to the quality of Ottoman professional soldiers. But discipline alone couldn't overcome the tactical situation. Surrounded, exhausted, under continuous fire, with no hope of relief or victory, even the best troops will eventually break or surrender. Tamerlane's treatment of prisoners after Ankara followed the pattern he established throughout his campaigns. Common soldiers were often incorporated into his own forces or released. Skilled craftsmen were identified and sent to Samarkand to work on his building projects. Important prisoners like Bayezid were kept under guard. The pyramid of skulls that Tamerlane was famous for constructing was reserved for cities that resisted after being called to surrender, a calculated terror tactic designed to encourage future enemies to submit without fighting. At Ankara, the battle was fought in open field, and the Ottoman army had been brave, so there was no need for such demonstrations. The practical brutality of Tamerlane's approach was that violence served strategic purposes. Excessive cruelty harmed his reputation and made future resistance more determined. Targeted terror, applied to specific cases of resistance, encouraged others to submit. It's a cold calculation that modern sensibilities find repellent, but that proved effective in the context of medieval conquest. The impact of Ankara on the development of Ottoman military doctrine was profound. When the empire recovered under Mehmed III and later rulers, Ottoman armies placed greater emphasis on firearms. The Janissaries, who had fought primarily with bows and melee weapons at Ankara, became handgun specialists within a few decades. Ottoman cavalry adopted pistols and carbines to supplement traditional weapons. This wasn't a complete abandonment of horse archery. Ottoman Sipahis continued using composite bows into the 17th century, but it reflected recognition that the old methods were becoming obsolete. The trauma of Ankara, where traditional Turkish horse archers had been outmatched by superior Timurid horse archers, drove innovation. If you couldn't beat them at their own game, you changed the game. The strategic implications of controlling water sources, as Tamerlane did at Ankara, cannot be overstated when examining pre-modern warfare. Medieval armies were enormous consumers of water, not just for the soldiers but critically for the horses. A warhorse in summer heat, particularly one carrying an armoured rider or wearing armour itself, could drink 10 to 15 gallons of water per day. Multiply that by tens of thousands of horses, and you're looking at water requirements that exceeded what most natural sources could provide without careful management. Bayezid's army arriving at Ankara to find the Subuk Creek diverted faced an immediate crisis that compounded with every hour. Horses suffering from dehydration lose stamina rapidly. Their performance degrades, they become harder to control, and they're more prone to panic. For an army that depended on cavalry for both shock power and mobility, this was catastrophic before the first arrow was even loosed. The engineering work required to divert a creek and create a reservoir demonstrated the sophistication of Timurid logistics. This wasn't something that could be accomplished overnight with untrained labour. It required surveyors who understood hydrology, workers who could dig channels and build earthworks, and time to complete the project before the enemy arrived. The fact that Tamerlane's forces accomplished this indicates he had advanced knowledge of Ottoman movements and planned the battlefield accordingly. His army included specialists beyond just warriors, engineers and craftsmen who could modify terrain to tactical advantage. This was another inheritance from the Mongol military tradition, which had incorporated Chinese siege engineers and technical specialists. The synthesis of steppe mobility with settled civilization's technical knowledge created a military force with unprecedented versatility. The physical endurance required for the style of warfare Tamerlane's forces practiced deserves more attention. Modern people often underestimate how physically demanding pre-modern combat was. Wearing armour for hours in summer heat while fighting was exhausting for Ottoman troops. But the Timurid horse archers faced their own challenges. Riding at speed for extended periods while repeatedly drawing a bow with a pull weight of 80 to 150 pounds required tremendous upper body and core strength. The legs had to control the horse while the arms and shoulders worked the bow. The back and abdominal muscles stabilized the torso for accurate shooting. After hours of this, even trained warriors would be approaching exhaustion. The difference was that Timurid forces could rotate units in and out of direct engagement, fresh troops replacing tired ones, while Ottoman forces, locked in position and unable to disengage, had no such option. The breeds of horses used by each side contributed significantly to the tactical equation. Timurid horses were descendants of Central Asian steppe breeds, smaller than European warhorses but with legendary endurance. These animals were bred for covering vast distances on minimal forage. They could subsist on grass where European horses required grain. They were nimble and responsive, capable of rapid acceleration and tight turns. A Mongolian horse, close relative to those used by Tamerlane's forces, could cover 60 to 80 miles in a day when necessary, and maintain a pace of 30 to 40 miles per day for extended periods. European destriers, by contrast, were bred for carrying heavy loads, the armoured knight and his equipment. They were powerful, but not built for endurance. In a battle of attrition where mobility determined survival, the steppe horses had an inherent advantage. The composite bow's construction details reveal why European bowyers couldn't replicate them successfully even when they understood the principle. The glue used in composite bow construction was typically made from the air bladders of fish, particularly sturgeon, or from boiled animal hides and sinew. This glue had to be incredibly strong yet slightly flexible, maintaining its bond under the tremendous stresses of the bow's operation while not becoming brittle. The application process required precise temperature control and humidity management. Too much moisture during construction, and the bow would be weak. Too little, and the materials wouldn't bond properly. The horn used for the belly had to be heated and shaped carefully, a process that, if done incorrectly, could crack or degrade the material. The sinew had to be properly cleaned, dried, and applied in multiple thin layers rather than thick ones. Each layer had to dry completely before the next was added. The entire construction process could take 6 months to a year for a high-quality bow, and then the bow needed to season for another year before reaching peak performance. The cultural knowledge required to produce these weapons was passed from master to apprentice over generations. A bowyer needed to know how to identify good materials, which trees produced the best wood, which animals provided the best horn and sinew, how to prepare and test materials, how to adjust the construction process based on the specific materials available. This wasn't something you could learn from a manual. It required hands-on experience and feedback from someone who already knew the craft. European attempts to produce composite bows often failed because they lacked this accumulated expertise. They might understand the theory but couldn't execute the practice successfully. By the time Europeans had access to examples they could study in detail, firearms were already making bows obsolete militarily, so there was little incentive to master a difficult craft for a weapon that was becoming outdated. The social structure of Tamerlane's army reflected Mongol military organization, but with modifications that showed his political sophistication. The decimal system provided organizational clarity, but Tamerlane overlaid this with ethnic and regional units that maintained traditional identities and rivalries. Uzbek troops competed with Chagatai Turks, who competed with Persian units. This internal competition, carefully managed, enhanced performance as units sought to distinguish themselves in combat, but it also required strong central authority to prevent the competition from becoming destructive. Tamerlane's personal charisma and reputation for rewarding success and punishing failure maintained this balance. The wealth from his conquests provided tangible rewards, cities to govern, lands to exploit, shares of plunder, all distributed based on merit and service. This meritocratic element coexisted with traditional aristocratic privilege. Tamerlane's own sons commanded major formations, but the system allowed for capable men of humble birth to rise to significant positions. The logistics of feeding an army of 140,000 men plus horses was staggering. Even assuming that the army brought herds of livestock with them, standard practice for steppe armies, the daily consumption was enormous. A man needs roughly 2,000 calories per day to maintain fighting capability, more if engaged in strenuous activity like combat. That's 280 million calories per day for the army, translating to roughly 140,000 pounds of food daily. Horses added to this burden. While they could graze when not actively fighting, they still needed supplemental feed, particularly grain for war horses before battle. The supply train for Tamerlane's army would have included thousands of pack animals carrying food, arrows, weapons, armour replacements, and other essentials. The organisational challenge of moving such a force, ensuring everyone was fed and equipped, maintaining order and preventing desertion, was as complex as the tactical challenges of battle itself. The intelligence network Tamerlane employed extended far beyond simple scouts. He made use of merchants travelling the Silk Road who could report on conditions in distant regions. He cultivated relationships with disaffected nobles in enemy territories who might provide information or switch sides at opportune moments. His diplomatic correspondence with Bayezid before the battle, demanding submission and receiving defiant refusal, served the dual purpose of establishing justification for war and gauging Ottoman morale and intentions. The defection of Anatolian and Tatar troops at Ankara wasn't spontaneous. Tamerlane's agents had likely been in contact with these units beforehand, offering incentives and reassurance about treatment if they switched sides. This preparation turned potential allies of Bayezid into weapons against him at the critical moment. The psychological warfare extended beyond the immediate battlefield. Tamerlane's reputation preceded him. His earlier campaigns had established him as one of the most formidable conquerors of the age, and stories of his victories and the terrible fate of those who resisted him circulated throughout the Islamic world and beyond. For Ottoman soldiers facing his army, there was the psychological burden of fighting someone whose legend was already established. Conversely, Timurid's soldiers had the confidence that came from serving a commander with an unbroken record of success. This intangible factor, morale and confidence versus doubt and fear, influenced behavior throughout the battle. Soldiers fighting with confidence are more willing to take risks, more likely to press attacks, and more resilient in the face of setbacks. Soldiers burdened with doubt are more prone to panic, more likely to interpret setbacks as signs of inevitable defeat, and more susceptible to collapse when things go wrong. The specific tactics used by horse archer units involved sophisticated coordination that modern observers might compare to aerial combat. Individual riders didn't fight alone, but as part of a larger formation that moved together. A common tactic was the caracole. Though this term is usually associated with later pistol-armed cavalry, the principle was similar. A line of horse archers would ride toward the enemy, loosing arrows, then wheel away to reload while the next line came forward. This created continuous pressure without exposing any single group of riders to extended danger. Another tactic was the feigned retreat, where horse archers would appear to flee, drawing pursuing enemy cavalry away from their supporting infantry, then suddenly turn and counterattack when the pursuers were isolated and exhausted. This tactic had been used by steppe peoples for centuries and had destroyed countless armies that fell for it. At Ankara, Ottoman cavalry charges that pursued retreating horse archers found themselves surrounded and subjected to fire from multiple directions. The role of sound in ancient and medieval battles is often underappreciated. The noise level during a major engagement was overwhelming. Thousands of voices shouting, screaming, dying, horses neighing, whinnying in pain or fear, the crash of metal on metal, the thud of arrows hitting shields, armor, or flesh, the blast of war horns and drums. In this cacophony, verbal communication beyond a few feet was impossible. Commanders relied on visual signals and on subordinate leaders who understood the battle plan and could exercise initiative within their designated roles. The psychological impact of sound also mattered. The whistling of thousands of arrows in flight created a distinctive noise that warned of incoming danger, but also contributed to the sense of being under constant attack. The screams of wounded men and animals eroded morale. The sound of enemy war drums, maintaining rhythm and coordination, was both impressive and intimidating. The archery techniques for different tactical situations varied significantly. When shooting at long range into massed formations, archers used high-angle indirect fire, loosing arrows upward at approximately 45 degrees so they would arc down onto the enemy. This maximized range and meant the arrows were falling at steep angles, striking the tops of helmets and shoulders where armor might be thinner. At medium range, archers used flatter trajectories, shooting more directly at targets. This allowed for better accuracy against specific individuals or weak points in formations. At close range, though horse archers avoided close combat when possible, they could shoot almost horizontally with devastating effect, the arrows having maximum velocity and penetrating power. The judgment of which technique to use in any given moment came from experience and training. Commanders would signal for massed volleys at specific times, but individual archers also exercised judgment based on their immediate tactical situation. The medical treatment available after the battle was primitive by modern standards, but not negligible. Both sides had physicians trained in the medical knowledge of their respective traditions. Islamic medicine in the 15th century was in some ways more advanced than European medicine, having preserved and built upon Greek and Roman medical texts, while also incorporating knowledge from Persian and Indian traditions. Physicians understood the importance of keeping wounds clean, though they didn't understand germ theory in modern terms. They used wine or vinegar to clean wounds, substances that happened to have antibacterial properties. They understood the need to remove foreign objects from wounds, though arrow extraction was dangerous and painful. Cauterization with hot iron was used to seal wounds and stop bleeding, brutally effective but traumatic. Opium was available as an analgesic, though in limited quantities. The survival rate from serious wounds was poor compared to modern medicine, but not everyone who was struck by an arrow died. Many men survived with permanent injuries, limps from leg wounds, limited use of arms from shoulder injuries, and these veterans became living reminders of the battle's horror. The economic impact of Ankara extended far beyond the immediate military consequences. The Ottoman state had invested enormous resources in Bayezid's army. The loss of that army, including not just the men but the horses, weapons, armour and equipment, represented a devastating economic blow. The treasury had been captured, depriving the state of funds needed for recovery. The instability that followed meant trade disrupted, tax collection impaired, and resources diverted to civil war as Bayezid's sons fought for succession. The regions that had provided troops suffered depopulation and economic disruption. Anatolia, which had supplied many of the defecting troops, faced years of instability as local lords reasserted independence or shifted allegiances. The Byzantine Empire, given a reprieve, managed to stabilize somewhat, but they too were economically exhausted and couldn't capitalize on Ottoman weakness as effectively as a stronger power might have. For Tamerlane, the economic benefits were substantial. The plunder from the campaign, including the Ottoman treasury, enriched his followers and funded future campaigns. The demonstration of power brought tributaries and vassals into line, ensuring continued revenue from territories already under his nominal control. The skilled craftsmen captured were put to work in Samarkand, enhancing the capital's wealth and prestige. But Tamerlane's economic model was fundamentally extractive rather than productive. He took wealth rather than creating it. This worked brilliantly during his lifetime when continuous conquest brought continuous revenue, but it meant his empire had no sustainable economic foundation. When the conquest stopped after his death, the revenue dried up, and the empire fragmented as various successors fought over what remained. The technological trajectory of military development visible at Ankara pointed toward the future even as it represented the culmination of the past. The composite bow was perhaps the peak of pre-gunpowder missile weapons technology, refined over millennia to approach the theoretical limits of what could be achieved with horn, sinew and wood. But firearms, though still primitive in 1402, represented a fundamentally different approach that would eventually supersede all bow types. Early firearms were inaccurate, slow to reload, unreliable in adverse weather and required minimal training. A bow in the hands of an expert was superior in almost every way, but the key word was expert. Creating that expert took years or decades. A firearm could be used effectively by someone with weeks of training. The mathematical inevitability was that as firearms improved, and they did rapidly, the training time advantage would overcome all other considerations. The social implications of this technological shift were profound. Bow-based warfare, particularly horse archery, reinforced aristocratic military culture. Only those with sufficient wealth and time could develop the necessary skills. Firearms democratized warfare in a sense, making individual soldiers more interchangeable, and reducing the importance of individual martial prowess. This contributed to the eventual decline of warrior aristocracies and the rise of professional standing armies composed of common soldiers. At Ankara, we see the old world at its peak. Warriors who had trained since childhood, using weapons that represented centuries of technological refinement, fighting with tactics developed over millennia. Within 2 centuries, this entire system would be obsolete, replaced by pike and shot formations, and eventually by armies dominated by musket-armed infantry and artillery. The romance of cavalry warfare, the individual skill of the mounted warrior, all of this would become anachronistic. The environmental factors at Ankara extended beyond water availability. The terrain was relatively flat and open, ideal for cavalry manoeuvre. Had the battle been fought in broken terrain with hills, forests or marshes, the tactical equation would have been different. Heavy cavalry performs poorly in restricted terrain, where their charges can be channeled and stopped. But horse archers also need room to manoeuvre, to execute their circling tactics and maintain distance. The open plain near Ankara suited Tamerlane's forces well, and his control of the area meant Bayezid had to fight on ground that favoured his enemy or not fight at all. The July heat was another factor that disproportionately affected armoured troops. While Timurid warriors wore some armour, mostly lamella or mail shirts, they weren't enclosed in full plate. They could cool, somewhat through perspiration. Ottoman knights in full harness had no such relief. The interior of plate armour became an oven in summer heat. Combined with dehydration from lack of water, this created a situation where Ottoman troops were physically compromised before fighting even began. The command and control systems used by both sides reflected their respective military cultures. Ottoman armies followed a model common to many medieval forces, with the Sultan and his immediate household troops forming the centre, trusted subordinates and family members commanding the flanks, and various contingents of allied or vassal troops filling out the ranks. Coordination between these different elements could be problematic, particularly when they came from different ethnic backgrounds and might not speak the same language. The Serbian knights, for example, took orders from Stefan Lazarevic, who took orders from Bayezid, creating a chain of command that could be slow and prone to miscommunication. Tamerlane's system, by contrast, was more unified. The decimal organisation meant clear chains of command with standardised procedures. The use of ethnic units created internal cohesion within formations, while the overarching organisational structure ensured they could coordinate effectively. This structural advantage contributed significantly to Timurid tactical superiority during the battle. The aftermath of the battle saw scenes that would have been familiar from battlefields throughout history. The wounded lying among the dead, begging for water or mercy, survivors searching for friends and comrades, victorious troops moving among the fallen, stripping bodies of valuables, weapons, and armour, the cries of wounded horses, many of which would have been killed to end their suffering. A horse with a broken leg or severe arrow wounds couldn't be saved with medieval veterinary medicine. The prisoners being rounded up, sorted, the important ones identified for ransom or political purposes, the common soldiers either incorporated into the victor's army or released to make their way home as best they could. The burial parties that would spend days dealing with thousands of corpses, burned or buried in mass graves to prevent disease. The scavengers, both human and animal, who came after the armies had moved on, picking through what remained.